We've talked about a lot of topics out of the book of Proverbs, and I really want to approach Proverbs again with a different topic in mind. I really want to focus on a word that we really don't use in our conversation that much anymore. It's kind of a Middle English term. The word is sluggard. Not to be confused with slugger. We're not talking about somebody that's very adept at hitting a baseball. Slugger is an individual that strikes hard or with heavy blows, but a sluggard, an habitually lazy person. And in several English translations, you'll find the word sluggard in the book of Proverbs in multiple places. So what does Scripture actually say? What does Proverbs say about the individual that is a lazy individual? What kind of characteristics do they have, and what kind of things are found in the life of somebody that's lazy that we need to avoid? Let's begin in chapter 13. In Proverbs 13, in verse number 4, the sluggard craves and gets nothing, but the desires of the diligent are fully satisfied. That's one of those contrasting verses we've seen multiple times. You have first phrase and the second phrase actually give opposite sides of a problem, or problem and a solution. The setting to begin with is one that's lazy. The person that's lazy craves and gets nothing. Why is that the case? The contrast of that is the desires of the diligent, those that have that work ethic, are fully satisfied. The problem with the sluggard in this particular verse is somebody that has a tremendous amount of desire for things without any kind of work ethic at all. Work is something that is a terrible word as far as the sluggard is concerned. I want things, but I don't want to put in any effort into trying to acquire them. Now, if we go from chapter 13 over just a few chapters to chapter 18, there's a statement that is found down in verse number 9. One who is slack in his work is brother to one who destroys. It really kind of builds upon what we just read in chapter 13. One who is slack in his work is somebody that actually is not building up, ultimately he's destroying. What is described here in this phrase, one who is slack in his work, is the kind of employee that no employer wants to have working for him or her. I've heard it said before, and it was a statement that was made in jest years ago, but it's probably been oft repeated, that a lot of individuals work just hard enough not to get fired. There's a lack of incentive of doing your best. We'll just do enough to get by. In fact, I heard a story one time of an individual that was talking to a business owner, and he asked the business owner, "How many people work for you?" The reply of the owner was, "About half." That's tragic, but oftentimes very true. The individual who is slack in his work, that one that is that sluggard, he's lazy, is brother to one who destroys. He may be putting in time, but just barely enough to stay on the payroll. Go from this chapter over just a couple of chapters later to chapter 20 and verse number 4. A sluggard that does not plow in season, so at harvest time he looks but finds nothing. What's the problem? There's no ambition. There's a lack of vision. This person can't see beyond today. He doesn't plan ahead at all. It's like, here's a paycheck that I receive, and it's blown by the end of that afternoon, and by the next week I'm wondering what I'm going to eat. Listen to the verse again. A sluggard does not plow in season, so at harvest time he looks but finds nothing. No ambition, no drive, no vision, no planning ahead. It's really not the mark of intelligence. We'll see a contrast between those two statements, intelligence and being lazy, a little bit later on in Proverbs. At this point, go from chapter 20 and verse 4 to the very next chapter, chapter 21, then in verse 25 and 26. The sluggard's craving will be the death of him because his hands refuse to work. All day long he craves for more. The last phrase of this second verse, verse number 26, is the opposite of that. The righteous give without sparing. The last phrase deals with somebody that's benevolent, has that benevolent heart. The sluggard, the lazy person, really doesn't. He craves, but he doesn't work. His craving will be the death of him because his hands refuse to work. It's not just no ambition, but now you have no ambition but obstinance. I'm not going to do that. That's not what I want to do. Without seeing that any kind of endeavor, if you're starving, is something that's worth doing if it's going to put food on the table. So you start to see that comparison between laziness and foolishness that's going to become very obvious by the time we close out these verses in Proverbs. In the very next chapter, chapter 22, verse number 13, the sluggard says, there's a lion outside, or I'll be murdered in the streets. And it's an exaggerated idea that suggests here's somebody that's using any kind of excuse they can find to not be involved in activity. I can't go outside. This is going to happen. That's going to happen. I can't go to work there. There are risks involved. What if somebody doesn't like me? What if the boss asks me to do something I've never tried to do before? Thinking of asking for help or instruction doesn't even cross their mind because they don't want to work in the first place. Here's the statement again. The sluggard's craving will be the death of him because his hands refuse to work. Then the sluggard says, there's a lion outside. It's a combination of that obstinance, I'm not going to work, but let me find an excuse. Let me find a reason why I can't. I'll be murdered in the streets. I can't go outside. There's an interesting connection between all of these verses, the way they kind of strain together. In chapter 24, beginning in verse 30, down through the end of the chapter, verse 34. Beginning in verse 30 of Proverbs 24, I went past the field of the sluggard, past the vineyard of the man who lacks judgment. There's that connection between foolishness and laziness. Thorns had come up everywhere. The ground was covered with weeds. The stone wall was in ruins. I applied my heart to what I observed and learned a lesson from what I saw. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come on you like a bandit, and scarcity like an armed thief. Not taking care of what you even own, letting things crumble around you, because I just am concerned with getting more rest and wringing my hands and wondering what's going to happen. Nobody's taking care of me, without enough incentive to get up and take care of yourself. The field of the sluggard, overgrown, useless, even the wall around it to protect it, no longer present. It's been torn down. Lessons to learn from somebody that is lazy and somebody that's foolish. Lessons that should not be repeated in your life or in mine. In chapter 26, beginning in verse 11 down through verse 16, here's that contrast between one who is foolish and one who's lazy. And we'll close with this part of Proverbs. Verse 11, as a dog returns to its vomit, so a fool repeats his folly. Do you see a man wise in his own eyes? There's more hope for a fool than for him. And then it shifts, but there's still a connection. The sluggard says there's a lion in the road, a fierce lion roaming the streets. We've seen those kind of excuses before previously in Proverbs. As the door turns on its hinges, verse 14, so a sluggard turns on his bed. Hard to get him up to do anything. I just don't feel good. I'm tired. Yeah, you've motivated yourself with a lack of anything other than I'm motivated to sleep and do nothing. Verse 15, the sluggard buries his hand in his dish. He's too lazy to bring it back to his mouth. Verse 16, the sluggard is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who answer discreetly. So what's involved in these verses? Verse 13, the excuses for inactivity. There's a lion in the streets, a fierce lion roaming the streets. Verse 14, just being non-productive because I don't want to be productive. As the door turns on its hinges, so a sluggard turns on his bed. Unambitious. The sluggard buries his hand in his dish. He's too lazy to bring it back to his mouth. And then a false conception of himself. The sluggard is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who answer discreetly. Which goes back to the statement, to see a man wise in his own eyes, verse number 12, there's more hope for a fool than for him. In addition to the connection between the fool and the sluggard, the foolish and the lazy, this last passage almost seems to say that the lazy person is even worse than the fool. What do we see in culture today? How much incentive to work? What kind of desire to really be productive? To do something that maybe benefits the neighborhood or the city or society, not just self. To see those kind of interest develop where the work ethic is something that is a sight to behold. People interested in doing things, in making things, in providing for their family and for others. And so doing, recognizing that because of that work ethic, because of that industrious nature, they have provided for their family and more. The individuals that don't understand that are people that have been conditioned to just ask for a handout. I remember a young man back in school, very smart student. And there are several others that are talking about college, and this student made the comment that I'm not going to college. And the rest of us said, why? And he said, you're smart enough, you've got great grades, and said, I don't need to. Once I get out of this, I'm done. Why? His response was, because when I get to a certain age, the government's going to give me a check every month for the rest of my life. I don't need to do anything. Benevolence is great as long as it doesn't kill incentive and ambition. Unfortunately, in some instances, well-meaning programs have beaten down that ambition and that drive, and that work ethic is on that endangered list that we've talked about before. When Proverbs talks about wisdom and understanding and knowledge, those instructions and those truisms are very clear. Same thing's true when Proverbs talks about the conditions of the heart, what the heart should be and what it shouldn't be, or those who are foolish and why that is wrong. Here, those who are lazy and why that is so destructive. The wisdom literature of the Bible, the wisdom book of the Hebrews, tremendous lessons to be learned that are sorely needed in our world today. Please stay safe. We'll talk again soon.